Hello, and welcome back to another First Chapter Friday. I am Miss Mary at the Dutcher Middle School Library, and today we are going to read our final installment celebrating Women's History Month with Adventurous Women, 8 True Stories About Women Who Made a Difference by Penny Colman. Without further ado, let's begin. Chapter 1. Cold? Yes, I love it. Louise Boyd, Arctic Explorer, 1887 to 1972. Louise Boyd grew up in California, a green and sunny land, yet fell in love with the Arctic, a cold, very cold region, mostly covered in ice, where during the long winter months the sun never shines. She got her first taste of the far north as a tourist in 1924. 4 years earlier, she had inherited $3 million when her father died just a year after her mother's death. Both her brothers had died of rheumatic fever as teenagers. Boyd had been traveling here and there trying to figure out what to do with her life. Finally, she traveled on a Norwegian steamer to Spitsbergen, an Arctic island northwest of Greenland, and to the edge of the pack ice, a jumble of massive hunks and blocks and piles of ice that forms in the polar basin and gets carried southward by the ocean currents. Ice that for much of the year forms barriers around the thousands of islands in the Arctic region. Ice that can crush a ship that stays too long as winter is setting in. Boyd got just a glimpse of the pack ice, but it was enough to make her determined to return to see more of the ice, and to see the land that lay beyond the ice. That land was Franz Josef Land, an archipelago of the 85 mostly ice-covered islands in the Arctic Ocean. 2 Austrian explorers had discovered it in the late 1880s and named it after Austrian Emperor Franz Josef I. I revel in the cold. 2 years after her first trip, Boyd went to Tromsø, a port in Norway, and tried to charter the Hobby, a small ship used to hunt seals, to go to the pack ice and Franz Josef Land. The captain, however, refused her money because he believed in the old superstition that women were bad luck to have aboard a ship. Boyd begged, pleaded, and cajoled until the captain relented. The day and night before the Hobby arrived at the pack ice, Boyd stayed on deck, awake for 24 hours. The captain and crew, she later explained, could smell ice and would stick their noses up and sniff it, and they expected me to. How could I know what ice smelled like? But I wanted to be there at the start, ready when the gates to the Arctic opened and let me enter. What was the loss of a night's sleep? Nothing. Thick fog prevented them from seeing the ice, but they could hear it crash and bang and groan and growl, along with the rumble and roar of the wind and waves. Hours passed as the captain guided the Hobby through the pack ice, sometimes ramming and grinding through solid ice, other times following open water called a lead that could be as small as a crack or a tiny stream and as big as a lake. Finally, they were on the other side of the pack ice. The fog lifted and the sun shone, and Louise Boyd surveyed the scene. I had a feeling of regret that isolation combined with some danger made such beauty inaccessible and known to so few. I understood for the first time what an old seaman meant when he told me that once you had been to the Arctic and in the ice, you never would forget it and always wanted to go back. Boyd, whom a society reporter once described as tall, blue-eyed, graceful, slender, erect, and elegant, had brought along 4 friends: Janet Coleman from San Francisco, the Count and Countess Rivadavia, and Francis de Gisbert, an expert on the polar region. Their purpose, at a time when there was little opposition to hunting and no protection of animals, was to hunt on Franz Josef Land. Boyd, credited as the first woman to set foot on Franz Josef Land, shot polar bears, including one at 40 feet that was charging her. I had a narrow escape, she later said. Bears move at an incredibly fast pace once they are charging over the ice, and the great thing for a person to do is to keep cool. During this trip, Boyd carefully collected botanical specimens from Cape Flora on Northbrook Island, including several species that had not yet been reported by anyone. She kept a written record of everything that she observed, from jagged peaks and dome-shaped glacier-covered mountains and islands positively alive with gulls, and sheltered spots with an abundance of white and yellow flowers of the anemone ranunculus family, to the moving, hummocky ice fields. A passionate photographer, Boyd shot 21,000 feet of film and took 700 pictures in order to study the sea and land ice, as well as the topography and natural history of Arctic lands. Once some crewmen of the hobby took her out in a small boat to get close-up pictures of polar bears. Suddenly, gale-force winds whipped up the water and the fog encircled them. The force of the wind and waves broke up the pack ice, setting chunks of it floating perilously close to their rowboat. Hours passed before the fog lifted, and they realized that in their attempt to return to the ship, they had been rowing away from the hobby instead of toward it. At the end of the 6-week expedition, Boyd said, "I revel in the cold. I have got the Arctic lure and will certainly go north again." Boyd was back 2 years later, in 1928, on board the hobby. She had intended to do more polar bear hunting, but instead she ended up hunting for some missing men, the famed Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen and his 5 companions. Ironically, they had been searching for another lost explorer, who was rescued shortly after the plane with Amundsen and his crew disappeared. Amundsen's achievements, first to reach the South Pole, first to navigate the Northwest Passage, first to fly over the North Pole, made his disappearance front-page news. A massive search was undertaken. Thousands of people sent money to help pay for the search. Icebreakers and cruisers and warships from Norway, Sweden, France, Italy, and Russia crisscrossed the dangerous wind-whipped waters filled with ice floes and shrouded in dense fog. Ski patrols searched desolate islands. Ice does such eerie things. Boyd offered the services of the hobby and its crew to the Norwegian government at her expense. "We felt it a privilege to give up our plans and join in the search for Amundsen," she later wrote. 2 pilots joined the crew, and their seaplanes were lashed to the hobby's lower deck. Boyd was in the middle of the action, and took her turn standing watch, even in the midst of violent winds and thunderous waves. 4 of us stood watch round the clock, she recalled. We would just stand there and look. Ice does such eerie things. There are illusions like mirages, and there were times we could clearly see tents. Then we'd lower boats and go off and investigate. But it always turned out the same. Strange formations of ice, nothing more. Amundsen and his companions were never found. The hobby had searched for 10 weeks and traveled some 10,000 miles along the coast of Spitsbergen, east to Franz Josef Land, and from there northward in the pack ice, as well as westward into the Greenland Sea. The King of Norway presented Boyd with the Order of St. Olaf for her part in the search. The French government made her a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. The French Navy presented to her a diamond-studded miniature of the medal inscribed with the words Hommage, Reconnaissance de la Marine Française à Miss Boyd, 1928. Her hometown newspaper published an article with the headline, Arctic Search Fun for Marine Tomboy. According to the article, folks here think of her as the little tomboy schoolgirl who rode her father's horses and frolicked with her 2 brothers. But city residents were not surprised at her latest adventure. She had spent years exploring the far places of the earth, and every once in a while comes home to say howdy and goodbye. Her experiences on board the hobby gave Boyd invaluable information about cruising in polar seas. Feeling ready to tackle even more hazardous waters, she planned to undertake an expedition in 1931 across the Greenland Sea to the east coast of Greenland, a region that was typically blocked by an ice belt as much as 150 miles wide. Her purpose was to photograph every fjord and sound in the region of Franz Josef and King Oscar fjords, part of the largest and most complex fjord region in the world. The region was a land, Boyd explained, where deep inlets cleave the coast and run back among the mountains as far as 120 miles, where walls of rock, bizarre in form and brilliant in color, rise to heights of more than a mile above the calm waters of the fjords, where mighty glaciers come down from the inland ice cap to the fjord heads, and spill over the valley walls. Land of extraordinary grandeur. Boyd chartered a bigger, sturdier vessel, the Valescari, 125-foot long and 27-foot wide sealing vessel, made of oak and green heart planking with a mast of California pine and a coal-burning engine. Hired a seasoned captain and crew, invited R.H. Menzies, a botanist, to join her, and assembled supplies: 250 tons of coal, 1,155 tons of fuel oil for the motor dory and other small boats, 9 tons of drinking water. 23 more tons were pumped on board from melting icebergs and used during the voyage. Photographic and botanical equipment and surveying instruments, 9 tents and 27 sleeping bags, and enough food for the voyage, plus an additional 3 months. Her list of clothing for the summer expedition included an oilskin coat and hip rubber boots needed for when the deck is rail under in seawater, woolen underwear, sweater, breeches, hobnailed boots, woolen muffler, fur cap, and woolen mittens. Weather and ice conditions for this expedition were terrible. At times the ice towered above the ship's railing. The captain spent days in the crow's nest searching for openings in the ice. The crew exploded dynamite that they tied to the ends of poles and stuck under the ice near the ship. The reward of crossing this belt of ice, Boyd later wrote, is access to a land of extraordinary grandeur and beauty. The expedition was a great success. Boyd visited every fjord and sound, made many shore trips, took thousands of photographs, collected botanical species, observed many birds and animals, visited several Inuit settlements, traveled to the inner end of the ice fjord, a feat no one else had yet accomplished, and she discovered a new glacier, the De Geer Glacier. All this fueled her desire to continue organizing and leading and financing scientific expeditions that would contribute to the knowledge of that alluring region, its majestic scenery, its plant and animal life, its geology and physiology, and the ice. Louise Boyd was full of confidence about her ability to organize an expedition and to deal with the demands and dangers of the Arctic region, but she had doubts about whether or not she was suited for leadership, particularly with a group of men. 7 years later, a reporter asked her about her experiences leading men, and she replied, "As for the men, most of them go back with me each voyage. We get along fine." In the history of Arctic exploration, Louise Boyd was the first woman to lead an expedition, undoubtedly because she had the combination of motivation and determination and ability, and perhaps most important, the money, to do it. But she was not the first woman to be an essential part of an expedition. Indigenous women had done that for years. A Chippewan Indian woman named Greenstocking participated in the preparation for Sir John Franklin's harrowing overland Arctic expedition in 1819 to 1822. Tukulito, an Inuit from Baffin Island, was the hero among the 19 people of the Polaris expedition who were stranded on the ice for 6 months in the late 1800s. Anneru Lungwak was awarded a medal from the King of Denmark for her participation in Knud Rasmussen's 1921 to 1924 expedition that covered 20,000 miles. Nevertheless, men dominated the world of Arctic exploration. Boyd eased her way through this world by not straying too far from the conventional definitions of femininity. "I like the pleasant things most women enjoy," she told a newspaper reporter, "even if I do wear breeches and boots on an expedition, even sleep in them at times. At sea, I don't bother with my hands, except to keep them from being frozen, but I powder my nose before going on deck, no matter how rough the sea is." Seawater poured in. Building on the success of her 1931 expedition, Boyd organized another one in 1933 with the help of the American Geographical Society, a professional organization that had used Boyd's extensive and detailed photographs to make large-scale topographical maps. Boyd, the leader and photographer, was joined by a surveyor, an assistant surveyor, a physiographer, a geologist, and a botanist, who developed appendicitis along the way and had to be sent back to Norway on a whaler that happened by. She added 2 tide gauges and a sonic depth sounding device to the equipment. The Velasquari reached open seas on July 4th, and it was the 3rd time Boyd had spent the 4th of July in Arctic waters. Although they were in heavy seas and the ship was railed under, Boyd reported that they celebrated by flying Old Glory and having the best the galley could provide, while seawater poured in to a depth of a foot on the floor of the galley, and cooking became almost an acrobatic feat. This time the voyage across the Greenland Sea was relatively ice-free, and they arrived at the east coast of Greenland in early July. Boyd and her staff spent the next 60 days taking photographs, making maps, exploring the fjords, and studying hundreds and hundreds of icebergs of all shapes and sizes that were formed by calving, or breaking off from glaciers. She observed that icebergs were the great source of noise in the fjords. You hear the trickle of small rivulets on the larger bergs, and the drip, drip of water splashing from their sides. The smaller ice formed from the calving of bergs makes a crackling sound in warm weather. Occasionally, there is a swish against the shore of waves produced by the overturning and breaking up of some ponderous mass. Loudest of all, like the sound of cannonading, is the boom of a berg as it splits off from its parent glacier, or the crash of bursting ice as a mighty berg collapses. These extraordinary sounds echo and re-echo through the fjords. For most of August, Boyd and her party camped in the Gregory Lake and Mystery Lake valleys. Inanimate nature seemed almost alive in these valleys, she wrote. Changes were constantly taking place in the topography. Rocks, large and small, single and in groups, constantly ripped down the steep mountainsides, forming deep troughs and rolling out on the valley floor. Ice calved off from hanging glaciers thousands of feet above us and spilled its fresh white substance over the vari-colored rocks. The first week of September, the Velasquari had started out of Franz Josef Fjord on its homeward journey when a ferocious gale stopped them. Nature was closing her door on us, Boyd later wrote. The snow of the coming winter had arrived. Extending from summit to sea level, as far as one could see, Greenland was white. Nature's warning to us was, "Go home." Fortunately, after a few days, the weather improved. The Velasquari set sail again, and finding the Greenland sea ice free, a most unusual condition, Boyd noted, reached the Lofoten Islands, Norway, in 4 days and 2 hours. Record time. Boyd planned her next 2 expeditions, 1937 and 1938, as a unit. The American Geographical Society had recently published her book, The Fjord Region of East Greenland, about her earlier expeditions, and the Society was eager to continue working with her. Boyd had 2 major objectives: to expand the use of the sonic depth sounding device to make bottom profiles of the Greenland Sea and the fjords, and to see how far north her expedition could get. The 1937 expedition left Iceland, Norway, on June 4th, and spent 2 weeks cruising along the coast and stopping at offshore islands with their rookeries, the nesting places for thousands of Arctic birds, eiders and Arctic terns, and long-tailed ducks. Then they set course for Bear Island, and then on to Jan Mayen Island, a desolate volcanic island that in the 17th century was the site of a major whaling station. On the very rare good weather days, Mount Berenberg was visible, and in Boyd's words, loomed up in majestic glory that few mountains can rival. Its 8,000-foot glacier-hung summit, a weather breeder and catcher of clouds and fog gleaming in the sunlight. They brought mail and news to the men at the weather station, and stayed several days to conduct various studies, take pictures, map a glacier, and observe the birds. They departed, Boyd wrote, with the all-important question when and where we should meet the ice. A tantalizing game of ice pack tag. They met the ice, dense, heavy ice in floes, some of which had 15-foot-high hummocks, on July 12th. It took them 14 days to bump, push, pull, wiggle, and dynamite a way through it. At times they could see the coast of Greenland, but their progress was a tantalizing game of ice pack tag, a sort of hide-and-seek with the coast. The return trip in August was even more harrowing when winter set in earlier than usual, and they got trapped between the coast and a belt of heavy polar ice with floes as high as the Valskari's stern. At one point, the ship was pinched by the heavy ice and tipped several degrees over to the side. It took well-placed sticks of dynamite to get free. Faced with the prospects of being stuck for the winter, or, worse yet, having the ship crushed by heavy ice, everyone on board worked day and night to find a way out. Crewmen hammered heavy ice anchors into floes to create leverage for pulling and shoving the Valskari through the ice. The captain and first mate took alternating non-stop lookout shifts in the crow's nest until the ship finally broke through at the end of August. While the ice and weather conditions in 1937 had been the worst Boyd had ever seen, they were better than ever before in 1938. That allowed the expedition to reach Ile-de-France, an island off Greenland, and make the furthest north landing ever achieved by ship on the east coast of Greenland. Along the way, Boyd and her staff of scientists visited many fjords and bays and islands where they stopped and went ashore to take pictures and gather information about the geology and plants and birds and animals. At Bessel Fjord, Boyd observed many musk oxen and gathered the wool that they had shed. "I have made a point of gathering the wool wherever I found it," she explained. She had mufflers and a sweater, dress, and jacket made for her by members of the Norwegian Home Industries in Aalesund, Norway. According to Boyd, there was no evidence that the Danish or Norwegian hunters or other visitors to Greenland gathered this wool. Even when I told the hunters of its merit, they seemed to feel that it was not worth bothering about. Boyd also warned prospective photographers in East Greenland of the menace of lone musk ox bulls in certain localities. A lone musk ox bull, she reported, would attack Boyd and her crew with a series of full-speed rushes, punctuated by halts, during which he tore into the ground with horns and hoofs. A gunshot into the air usually scared the ox away. However, once they had to shoot a bull, "We got it," Boyd said, "before he got me." The Valskari arrived back in Norway in early September. The expedition had gathered a wealth of information, including the discovery of an ocean bank, or a mountain ridge, later named Louise Boyd Bank, along the bottom of the Greenland Sea, between Bear Island and Jan Mayen Island. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 put an end to Louise Boyd's independent expeditions. Realizing the strategic importance of the region and her treasure trove of invaluable experience and knowledge, Boyd volunteered her services to the United States War Department. In 1941, she led an expedition sponsored by the U.S. government to study the effects of polar magnetism on radio communications. In 1949, she was honored by the Department of the Army for her outstanding patriotic service. In 1955, Louise Boyd, at the age of 68, made her last trip to the Arctic region. This time, she was in an airplane and became the first woman to fly over and around the North Pole. On board, she had the flag of the Society of Women Geographers. "North, north, north we flew," she later wrote. Soon, we left all land behind us. From the cabin window, I saw great stretches of ocean flecked with patches of white floating ice, and as I saw the ocean change to massive fields of solid white, my heart leaped up. Then, in a moment of happiness, which I shall never forget, our instruments told me we were there. For directly below us, 9,000 feet down, lay the North Pole. No cloud in that brilliant blue sky hid our view of this glorious field of shining ice. During her life, Boyd received many awards and honors, including 3 honorary doctorates. The Geographic Institute of Denmark named the land between the glaciers she discovered, Daguerre Glacier and Jat Glacier, Miss Boyd Land. The American Polar Society honored her. The American Geographical Society elected her to the Council of Fellows, the first woman to achieve that status in the Society's 108-year history. She was elected a member of Britain's Royal Geographical Society, which had refused to admit women until 1912. In 1967, the Explorers Club in New York City honored Boyd as one of the world's greatest women explorers. As always, Boyd arrived elegantly dressed. This time she wore a pink dress and a spray of fresh white orchids. "I don't feel dressed unless I'm wearing flowers," she once told a reporter. Even in Greenland, I'd find something and wear it with a safety pin. She also said that she always wore a hat. I've never thought of going without one, unless it was to the dentist. Louise Boyd died in sunny California in 1972, and as she had requested, her cremated remains were scattered over ice-covered land. And that is the end of our reading of Adventurous Women, 8 True Stories About Women Who Made a Difference by Penny Colman. There are 7 more wonderful stories of great women, and I highly recommend checking this book out. And as always, it is available for checkout at the Dutch Middle School Library. Thank you for joining me for another First Chapter Friday, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.